Hi there, it's Mrs. Mortimer here from West Bloomfield High School. Today our topic is Intelligence, Heredity, Environment, and Human Diversity. This is from our unit on testing and individual differences. We're going to start today with a question that really doesn't so much involve intelligence as it does achievement. Should ACT scores be used to determine college admission? Now, I can imagine that you might have some strong feelings on this. As you've applied into college, you've taken the ACT. Should we consider your ACT scores as a factor in your admittance to a university? If we look at ACT scores themselves, there's a lot of things that go into them. For example, how good of a test taker are you? How much did you study and prepare? Do you have test anxiety? What kind of a school did you go to? How involved were your parents with your education? Did you take an test preparation course? Could you afford to take an AC test preparation course? How did you feel the day that you took the test? Were you sick? Were you healthy? These are just a few of the factors that influence your score on your ACT test. So should ACT scores be used to determine college admission given all these various factors that go into your score itself? Let's dig a little bit deeper and try to ask a question. Is the ACT a very good predictor of your success in your future? And so the data that I'm going to share with you comes from ACT's website. Here we have a chart that says relative weights for predicting college success outcomes. In the first column we see first year GPA. That's your first year GPA at college. So it's your GPA as a freshman in college. Across the top we see ACT scores. Those are your ACT scores in high school, and we can compare them to your high school grades. Underneath are a couple of numbers. These are correlational coefficients, and in our next slide we're going to review a little bit what a correlational coefficient is. Here's our correlational coefficient. This is our R value. It shows sort of the degree of relatedness. How strong is the relationship between two different variables? And it ranges from a -1 to 1. A correlational coefficient of 1 is a perfect relationship. As one thing goes up, the other one goes up. So, for example, conceivably, the higher your grade point average in high school, the more money you make in your future. Okay, that would be a positive correlation. A -1 is a negative correlation. It's still a very strong relationship, but as one thing goes up, the other one goes down. So for example, as you get fewer hours of sleep, perhaps your grades go up because you're studying so much. That would be an inverse relationship, a negative correlation. What you don't want is 0. 0 is no relationship at all. The following guidelines are useful when determining the strength of a positive correlation. If it's a 1, it's a perfect positive correlation. If about 0.7 to 0.99 is a very strong positive relationship, 0.4 to 0.69 is a strong positive relationship, 0.3 to 0.39 is a moderate positive relationship, 0.20 to 0.29 is a weak positive relationship, and a 0.01 to a 0.19 is no or a negligible relationship. So again, we want it as close to 1 as we possibly can. 0 is no relationship existing at all. And so let's go back to our chart here of relative weights for predicting college success outcomes. And once again, we're looking at your first year GPA in college. If we look at your ACT score, there is a 0.42 correlation between ACT scores and your first year GPA. That's a fairly strong relationship that you see there. The high school grades is a little bit stronger. okay, when it comes to the relationship between your high school grades and your first year GPA. Now, there are other ways of measuring it, and this is a second way of measuring it that they did that took into account socioeconomic status as well as some other factors. And in this case, when we look at first year GPA measured a second way, your ACT scores, it actually declines a little bit to a 0.31. High school grades, again, back to a 0.31. These are only moderately strong variables. It's really nothing that strong. We can also look at other things, and I think that this is really kind of interesting. We can look at your final college GPA. So at the end of your college career, how did that originally relate to your ACT scores? And here we see a fairly weak relationship. So by the time you finish college, that relationship is really pretty weak. High school grades, 0.35, a little bit stronger. What about this? This is degree attainment level. So how much of a degree did you get, if you got a degree at all? And the levels are vocational, technical certificate, associate's degree, a bachelor's or other 4-year degree, your master's or other 5-year degree, or specialist or other 6-year degree, and a doctorate. That's a PhD, Ed.D., etc., or professional degree. It turns out when you look at those original ACT scores all the way back to high school, it's a fairly weak relationship here. And if you look at your high school grades, its relationship to the degree that you ultimately attain is very minimal. So should ACT scores be used to determine college admission? To try to answer this question, we're going to look at intelligence, and which is related to achievement, not quite the same thing, but it's related. And we're going to look at the sorts of things that influence IQ scores. And so we have intelligence, heredity in the environment, and human diversity. We're on page 138 of your course pack. We have some learning targets for today. First of all, by the end of this you should be able to explain how our genetics and environment influence our IQ scores. You should also be able to debate what is the best way to measure IQ in a diverse culture. So we start with a nature-nurture debate, and we're back to our babies. On the left-hand side we see nature, and then on the right-hand side there's nurture. To what extent is our intelligence determined by genetics or our environment? We have heritability coefficient. And so many psychologists estimate that the true heritability quotient of IQ is about 0.50, and there is some variation in that. Different psychologists vary this number slightly. Thus, about half of the variation among people is due to heredity, due to genetics. Now, just a reminder to you, the heritability coefficient ranges from 0 to 1 and is a rough measure of the proportion of variation among individuals that can be attributed to genetic effects. So it's how much you can blame genetics when it comes to the variation across our culture. For example, if you take this group of people, they come from, this is the Portland episode of, what is that on MTV? Yeah, you've got it. If you take a look at this group of people and you think of all their various intelligences, okay, that variation, about half of it, you can blame on their genetics, and about half of it you can blame on their environmental influences in their lives. It's really important to realize that the heritability of a trait has nothing to do with its modifiability, or in other words, how much you can change it. For example, height is highly heritable, but heights have been increasing over the last several generations. And so if we take a look at our chart here, this is our average height across the left-hand, the vertical axis there, and across the horizontal axis you see dates. You see that for both men and women in the United States, height has been increasing. Height, although strongly influenced by our genetics, is nevertheless something that can be changed and modified across time. Same thing is true with intelligence. Psychologists have long researched and long debated the causes for variation in IQ scores across culture. When you give IQ scores to different groups of people in the United States, we find some racial differences that occur. Racial differences in IQ scores show African Americans, Native Americans, and Hispanic Americans typically scoring about 10 to 15 points below the mean for white Americans, with Asian Americans scoring higher than the mean for white Americans. Now there's a couple, I think, really important points to make about this data. And the first is this: IQ scores do not equal intelligence. IQ is a social construct that was created by people to try to capture intelligence, but they're not the same thing. And I think that that's important to recognize when we are looking at IQ scores. The other thing that I think is really important to point out is that although we have a lot of variation in IQ scores, these are not things that result from race. And I think that we have to be very, very clear about this. There have been people in the past who have attempted to look at these differences in IQ scores and use it to justify racism and oppression. There was a book that was written a few years back that basically blamed these differences in IQ scores on race. And I think that it's important to point out that there is absolutely no scientific backing for that conclusion. In fact, it's kind of interesting that this is a phenomenon that we see not just in the United States, but really across the whole world. If we look at different classes of people in places like India, Israel, Japan, Australia, the classes of people who tend to be oppressed tend to score lower on these IQ tests. And again, it has nothing at all to do with genetics. So what does it have to do with? And this has been a question that psychologists have been trying to address for a very long time. Psychologists point out something that when they start comparing groups of people. And so you have within group differences and between group differences. Psychologists point out that when comparing groups of people on any construct such as intelligence, it's important to keep in mind the concept of within group differences and between group differences. What exactly does that mean? The range of scores within a particular group is much greater than the differences between the mean scores of two different groups. And so I'm going to use this analogy of some different flower planters here. And you see some shorter flowers on the left-hand side. You see some taller flowers on the right-hand side. They both come from the same seed packet, so they are genetically identical to one another. But there is a difference between those two groups, and those differences largely result from their soil types, their poor soil versus fertile soil. Now, what within group differences versus between group differences mean is this. The average difference on the left-hand side, if you look at that planter, between the tallest flower and the shortest flower is always greater than the differences between those two groups of flowers. We spend a lot of time talking about the differences between races and the variations between races, but the truth of the matter is that there is always more variation within individual groups. So returning to this idea of how do you explain variation in IQ scores, researchers such as Leon Kamen argued that differences in average IQ between groups could be caused entirely by environmental factors such as socioeconomic factors. And so we go back to this idea of soil type, okay, that if you grow flowers in poor soil, they don't receive much sunlight, they don't get much nutrition, they tend to be much smaller and shorter than those that are raised in more fertile soil. And we have many minority groups in our country who have historically not had the same opportunities as other groups of people. Kind of interesting is the work of Claude Steele, and this is Claude Steele. And he was working with the concept of stereotype threat. Claude Steele further hypothesized that at least part of the difference in IQ can be attributed to stereotype threat, or the anxiety that influences members of a group concerned that their performance on a test will confirm a negative stereotype. The way it works is like this. There are many stereotypes that surround different groups of people, and you become so sort of concerned with living up to that stereotype that it adds an extra anxiety that brings down your scores. It's a little bit like trying to take a test with an anchor tied around you. where because you are so worried about fulfilling a stereotype, you don't do as well on the test. And Claude Steele looked at an awful lot of different sorts of stereotype threats, and here are some examples of common stereotypes out there. Girls are bad at math. You come from a poor neighborhood, so you'll never do well. Oh, you're a stupid athlete. Jocks are so dumb. Boys aren't creative. You can't score high in math because you're white. You are too young. You will never do as well as older kids. These are all different stereotypes out there that help to drag people down, that weigh them down while they are going through different tests. Now, this was never really real to me, and I understood it, and I've taught it for years and years, but it didn't mean much until I had an experience a few years back. And this is me. I'm the tall one in the back, and my daughter is on the far left-hand side. She's the one who's missing her front tooth with the little blonde hair there. And this was her t-ball team. Before this picture was taken, before she was even on this team, we got a phone call at our house asking if my husband wanted to coach the team. And he couldn't at the time, but he suggested that I coach the team, that might be a good idea because I had coached high school softball for a time several years ago. And so I agreed to coach the team, and there was sort of like this informational meeting for all the coaches to attend before the season even started. And I was running kind of late that day. I was about 10 minutes late for the meeting. And so I go to this place in Troy. It's called the Shack. It's where the TBB, the Troy Baseball Boosters, meets. And I'm hustling my way upstairs. Again, I'm late. And I walk into this room, and there's this big, long table with about 20 people sitting around it. The meeting had already started, and I go to sit down, and I notice that I am the only female in the room. And I'm thinking, what did my husband get me into? But I sit down, and the meeting continues on. And as the meeting progresses, I start to have some questions. I'm kind of wondering about a few things. A lot of these guys had coached before. I had never coached through TBB. But a curious thing happened. I didn't ask my questions. I didn't ask them. And I left the meeting feeling very confused because I didn't have my question answered. And I'm getting in my car, and teaching psychology, you're always wondering sort of why things happen. And I start to question, why was it that I didn't ask any questions in this meeting? I'm kind of an outspoken person. I'm not somebody who's shy about asking questions. I consider myself to be a professional, and I couldn't figure it out. And all of a sudden, it sort of hit me like a ton of bricks that this is what stereotype threat was. I didn't ask questions in front of all those guys because I didn't want to seem like a dumb girl. And so instead of asking questions that would have helped me to be a better coach, I kept my mouth shut because I was worried about fulfilling a stereotype for women. And I think that this probably was stereotype threat, and it had a big impact on me in the way that I think about this. There are obviously lots of stereotypes out there. And it's equally clear that they're not true. However, they can still impact us and affect us in some pretty dramatic ways. So those are some of the factors that influence intelligence scores. We talked a little bit about this idea of Kamen's work with socioeconomic status affecting IQ. We talked about stereotype threat impacting IQ scores. This is not in your course pack, but I'd like you to add it. There is also a problem with culture-specific content on tests. What exactly do we mean that? And I think a good way to demonstrate this is from a question from the SAT. And I know it's not an intelligence test, but I think it'll give you a good idea about what we mean by culture-specific content. This was a past question on the SAT. Runner is to marathon as A, envoy is to embassy, B, martyr is to massacre, C, oarsman is to regatta, D, referee is to tournament, or E, horse is to stable. The correct answer to this is runner is to marathon, as oarsman is to regatta. Past question on the SAT. Well, what exactly is a regatta? A regatta is a boat race. And we can begin to ask this question, is this question biased against certain cultures? Who is most likely to know about a boat race, a yacht race like this? Well, certainly wealthier people who have the leisure and the money to buy boats. Who else might do well on this question? People who live near water. What about some rural kid in Iowa? Are they going to know or be exposed to what regatta is? This is this idea of culture-specific content on different tests. Let me give you an example from an IQ test that was given. This is a past question off the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children. It's since been removed. But the question was this: what is missing in this picture? The correct answer to that is the nose. What they found happening, though, when they gave the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children is that some Asian children would answer the body, and then they would get the question wrong. Well, why would some Asian children answer the body? It turns out that if you look at traditional Asian artwork, there's not really a history of portraiture. In other words, there's not really a history of doing artwork with people sort of sitting there like a portrait. Okay? Instead, what we tend to find are scenes of nature or entire bodies. And so for some Asian kids who were raised in very traditional Asian households, it was stranger not to see the body than not to see the nose. Again, this idea of having questions that are biased based on culture. So how do we fix this? Researchers have attempted to solve these problems, these different biases in IQ testing, in a lot of different ways. In California, they've been banned. Okay, you can't use an IQ test as the sole measure for placing a student into special education. What else has gone on? Researchers have tried to create culture-free tests, and an example of that is Raven's progressive matrices. It's the idea of creating a test that it doesn't have anything at all to do with culture. And so let me give you an example. What you see here, and the test is given in whatever your native language is in, but you are asked to sort of fill in that blank shape there in the lower right-hand corner of the square. Here's a more difficult one from Raven's matrices. And so find the missing piece in the pattern, look across the rows and down the columns, and then you have to select which of those you think fills in the hole. Now, if you want to try and figure this out, you might want to hit pause if you haven't figured it out already. A third solution to this is to try to create culture-relevant tests that incorporate skills and knowledge related to the cultural experiences of the test taker. This is tricky. It is. It can be done in minor ways. Okay, and you've experienced a little bit of this in some of the tests that you've taken in here. For example, you might have noticed that a lot of the people's names on the tests that we take in AP Psychology come from lots of different cultural backgrounds, and that's purposeful. It's an attempt to create more culturally relevant tests. And so these are some of the names from the test from Sensation and Perception that I pulled off. Okay, they are meant to come from various cultural backgrounds. So going back to our learning targets, hopefully by the end of this you can now explain how our genetics and our environment influence our IQ scores. And we're trying to open up the argument, the debate a little bit about what is the best way to measure IQ in a diverse culture. To assess that a little bit, we are going to move to a journal entry. The journal entry is titled ACT, and so if you could please take out your journal. And I'm going to ask you to respond to this prompt. Assuming that there are many similarities between IQ tests and achievement tests, to what extent should the ACT be used to determine college admission? Secondly, How should colleges decide who to admit? Be sure to use examples from this lecture to support your position as you answer this question. We are going to use this as a topic for discussion. I would think that your answer, would be longer than a quick write. I would spend probably about 5 or 10 minutes thinking and answering this question. By the way, the correct answer to the 2 questions from Raven's matrices, both of those questions, the correct answer was 1. All right, I hope that you've learned a little bit about IQ and the influences of heredity in our environment on IQ scores. This is Mrs. Mortimer from West Bloomfield High School. I hope you go out and have an awesome day.